The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Then let us pray. Father, the snows have fallen upon us, and you've again reminded us of the beauty of the seasons and the challenges of the time and the ways we can be unique neighbors to one another. We thank you also for making it clear on this Sabbath day so that we can gather again to ponder your word and be fed by the sacraments. So let your Spirit preside over this discussion for this hour as we talk about Jesus in his hometown synagogue. We ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen. All three synoptic Gospels tell this story, but they tell it in different places. By that I don't mean different places like Nazareth one time and Capernaum another, but different places in the chronology of the story of the Gospels unfolding itself. Luke, curiously but effectively, puts it at the very beginning of the telling of the Gospel story. The baptism with John the Baptist has taken place. Luke has recounted that in special detail. And then the temptations have taken place. And again, Luke records that with some details unique to Luke. And then we have this interesting, and Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee, and a report concerning him went out through all the surrounding country. And he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. And that becomes a transitional graph between the temptations and the baptism as this block. Remember I said last Sunday, we have to tell those stories together really to make sense out of either one of them. And so now Luke takes us out of that story, brings us up out of the waters of the Galilee, down from the Mount of Temptation, and into the region of the Galilee. And by the way, Galilee is a root Hebrew term that has to do with a circle, and the Sea of Galilee is sort of a circle. And that region was called the Galilee of the Gentiles because the territory was not solely Jewish, but was also heavily influenced by the Gentiles. For example, just 2 miles away from Nazareth, whatever Nazareth was, and I'll get to that in a moment, there's the huge Roman city of Sepphoris. It was destroyed by an earthquake and rebuilt again by the Romans. And many biblical scholars believe that Nazareth was a little town that provided the artisans that helped build Sepphoris, and that Jesus and his dad Joseph may well have laid their hands upon the project of rebuilding this Roman city. A significant city with theaters and baths and all those kind of things that Roman cities had. But so that it tends to overshadow Nazareth, and there's not much archaeologically left of Nazareth as we would know it. And yet Josephus would have suggested it might have been a town of as many as 15,000 people. So you have Josephus, who was the governor of the region of the Galilee before he defected and went with the Romans. And so nobody's quite sure what Galilee was at that time. But we see Jesus going from the Transjordan and the baptism of John and the temptations and the Mount of Temptations up to Galilee, which was his home area. And you might ask, why did he go to Galilee? Well, first of all, in Judea you have the Jewish aristocracy within the religious order. You have the chief priests, the scribes, the temple order, and all the like. There's not likely to be much openness to hear what Jesus has to say, even though many from Jerusalem went out to be baptized by John. So we don't know exactly why he went to Galilee, but he did. Another reason and conjecture is that Galilee was a restless place. They were always interested in new ideas, and they were often revolting in Galilee. So if Jesus came along and stirred up the crowd a little while, he'd probably get, at least initially, a pretty positive hearing. So it was fertile ground for a traveling preacher, to say the least. By way of introduction, our story today. We'll read it in a few moments, but I'll talk about some background things first. Let's begin by talking about the synagogue. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to a lesser extent Luke, have made us aware that Jesus' fame had gone before him. Now, while it appears that this trip to his hometown is his first, this transitional phrase suggests that it might not have been, that Jesus might have done other signs and healings and things before this trip to his hometown in Nazareth. And he taught in their synagogues, plural, being glorified by all. So that's St. Luke's prologue to this story. I'd also want to argue that the story itself is a prologue to what's going to happen in Luke, but more about that in a moment. The synagogue as an institution entered Jewish life at the time of the exile, when Jews were scattered into what is called today the diaspora, the dispersing of Jews around the world, and in some cases exiled into Babylon. The synagogue became the way of maintaining Jewish culture and teaching and worship and family life in Jewish traditions. It was, if you'll forgive the term, it was the equivalent of our Sunday school. It was not the temple. In Lancaster, the conservative synagogue, which is the one in the middle, there's the Orthodox, the conservative, and then the liberal Jewish groups. The conservatives, which sound like they're conservative, are kind of in the middle. They're neither orthodox in the sense that they rigidly keep all the laws, nor are they reformed in the sense that they are, to visit a reformed synagogue in the United States is almost like visiting a New England Congregationalist church where they aren't sure about the Trinity. It's an interesting kind of movement from here to here to here. But we have a conservative who takes things pretty seriously, a conservative synagogue in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, called Temple Bethel. Bethel is the temple, is the house of God. Beth is house. El, E-L, is not something we brew. E-L is a Hebrew word for God. So, but then again, I know some people that think what's brewed is God. But anyway, Bethel is house of God in Hebrew, and this was called Temple Bethel. And I used to give the good rabbi, who was a good personal friend, a lot of grief about that, saying, how do you use the word temple? Because temple really is Jerusalem and no other place. Temple is the only place that sacrifices can be made. The temple requires the Levitical priesthood. Remember, there were 12 tribes, and the Levitical tribe was set aside as priest. It continues to this day. How many have heard the Jewish name Cohen, C-O-H-E-N? Well, the Kohanim are the priest, and they would trace their background to Levi. If the temple was ever rebuilt, all the Kohanim would have to go back to Jerusalem to run the temple. I doubt they all would, but that would be what would happen. The temple, of course, was destroyed by Rome finally and totally in 70 A.D., and they built a Roman temple there on that holy spot, desecrating the holy spot. And then later, that was destroyed, and ultimately, the Caliph of Jerusalem, Omar, built not a mosque, it's a place of prayer over the rock, which was probably the rock where the slaughters were done in the temple days, because Muhammad was supposed to have leaped with his horse off the rock and gone to Mecca. So it's the third holiest place in Islam. So there is now the Dome of the Rock, it's called. Some call it the Mosque of Omar. It is not a mosque. It's a wrong name. The mosque on the Temple Mount is Al-Aqsa Mosque, the small one in Islamic language, and it's to the south. At any rate, on the same Temple Mount, but to the south. The Dome of the Rock, built by Omar in the 6th century, is quite a historic landmark. Nobody is going to suggest that the Jewish government should take over. You want to talk about a riot, the Jewish government take over the top of the Temple Mount and tear down the mosque and rebuild the temple. They would be just, well, if the whole world isn't already against Israel, it would certainly be at that point. So that's not a policy. Only the very conservative Jews and the reasonably conservative Christians ever talk about rebuilding the temple. One of the times I got in the most trouble I've been in Israel was my being there unaccounted for at the Albright Institute for a period of sabbatical study. And when I went to leave, I couldn't get out because they wanted to know who I'd talked to and where I'd been and all those kind of things. What turned out was they found a whole cache of dynamite on the Temple Mount and believed it had been put there not by radical Muslims but by Christians, with the idea that if the Dome of the Rock was destroyed. So here I come through in a shirt and tie but a clerical collar on my passport, and I was instantly stopped. Why are you traveling incognito? And an interesting story, but that's not here. At any rate, not even the serious Jews think about rebuilding the temple or reinstituting the rites of sacrificial worship. The Jews in the United States say, we've learned that we can live with God and be children of God and experience God's blessings without the sacrifices. So we don't need to do that anymore. So there's no real drive within Judaism to go back to that system. So the synagogue is the remnant of a people sent into diaspora who could not get back to a temple and ultimately who had no temple to go back to. And the synagogue began to be the backbone of their religious education and practice. And since the Jews still live mostly in diaspora today, they still depend upon the synagogue as being the source of religious life. Let me pause for a minute because a lot of us know something about synagogues and maybe you have questions. Yes?
Just a comment. When we were in Jerusalem, we were told that if Jews tried to rebuild the temple, it would be World War III.
It would be worse than that, I think. You heard the comment, if Jews tried to rebuild the temple, it'd be World War III. There was an archaeological study done by Ben Hav at the Tel Aviv University, a Tel Aviv University archaeologist, who on the surface of the mount began to find indications of earlier building on the mount, and he came to the conclusion that the understanding of the temple being in the center, roughly, of the Temple Mount was wrong. It had been, in fact, in the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. And he had photographs and drawings and other things to make, which would have meant, had that been proven to be true, the Jews could have rebuilt the temple without destroying or bothering. There could have been two religions on the Temple Mount. Well, shortly thereafter, bulldozers came in and the whole Temple Mount got reforested with big trees so that those archaeological telltale spots have now been destroyed and can't be pursued because the Temple Mount, since the 67 war, by sundown that day, the Israeli general returned the control of the Temple Mount to the Islamic mufti, so that the Temple Mount top is under the control of the Islamic authorities the Temple Mount itself under control of the Israeli authorities. But it was a swift political move on the part of the Israeli general, and that's been the way it's been since 1967. But since they're in control, they simply do their own digging, and they don't do it archaeologically. So that whatever was there has gradually and systematically been destroyed or removed. Other questions? It's got some nice tall trees on it now. Okay. I'm sorry? Any other questions? Well, we'll move on. You have in this paper pictures of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century synagogues. The synagogue on the front page is at Capernaum. It's 3rd to 4th century synagogue at Capernaum. Why do we say that? Well, it's made mostly of white marble, which is not available in this region and which would have been terribly expensive for a fishing village to have reared. However, if you look on page 2, at the top of the page, left-hand side, you will see the walls of this gradually rebuilding synagogue. As they find stones that fit, they restack them. They're not restacking any stones, they're matching stones to faces of other stones. So it goes up gradually. It's far higher than when I first started going, but still there are many stones scattered around. You'll see in the bottom a black basalt foundation and a pit dug here to see a lower ground level. This synagogue, this basalt synagogue, was destroyed by an earthquake, and but look at what they've done. They rebuilt the succeeding synagogue right exactly on the foundation of the first synagogue. Do you see what I'm talking about here? The white marble is on top of the basalt. Basalt, by the way, is volcanic lava rock. And that whole area is basalt, and the city was basalt, as you could see if you'd see it. You understand what I'm talking about? The foundation here, and the rebuild is right on top of the old one, exactly on top of the old. Why was that? Once ground was dedicated, it could never be taken back. Once you make the gift to God and it becomes sacred, it never ceases to be sacred. Even if somebody else tries to desecrate it, it won't work, because you can't desecrate that which belongs to God. Okay? So that the foundation is still holy, and so they'll build right on top of it over and over. And there's a church outside of Reading, Pennsylvania, that's been hit by lightning 4 times. And I was called to be the speaker to raise monies for the new church they're going to put up after the 4th one has been burned down. And I said, has it ever occurred to you to move this building about 50 yards? Because God's got the aim on this sucker. No, this is God's land. Okay. I'd suggest a very good lightning rod. Anyhow, they would build right on top of the other one. So this 3rd or 4th century synagogue is indeed built on top of the foundation of the first one. Now let's turn back to page 1 a minute. If you look in the middle, inside what would have been a row of columns, which they still haven't stacked up on this side. Well, let's talk first of all. On this side, there are stone bleacher seats. They go up the side. Same over here on the right side. And most archaeologists believe this was simply a 2-story building, and that up this left wall there was a 2nd floor with bleachers on it, and the same on the other side. What you can't see is there's an assembly hall attached to the right side of this building, which is reasonably sizable. A respectable Seder meal could have been held for the entire community of Capernaum there in that room. That is not always the case, to have that extra room attached to the side of the building for social functions, just like we would have done. If you look in the center of the floor, just north, south, east, west, and leaning to the left-hand side, you'll see what looks like whiter stones. Do you see them there? They really are much whiter than that, and the light isn't good. But that would have been where the Bema, B-E-M-A, which is a platform, would have been. And that's where there would be a large podium or table on which you could roll a scroll out, and with a pointer for that purpose, read the Hebrew. Remember, right to left, not left to right. And so you had to roll the scroll out. One of our translations says, and he gave the book back to the man. It wasn't a book, it was a scroll. Well, that section right there is different color stones because it was excavated to find the floor of the first century synagogue, and they found it. And once they found it, documented it, photographed it, this floor was replaced, but the stones are not quite the same color. Why do I mention that? Because when Jesus taught, and probably when he healed, and he did both often at Capernaum, because this was kind of this was like Minneapolis to Billy Graham. This was his headquarters, all right? And he would have been right there, folks, on a floor about a foot deeper than he's standing now. So if you want to say, well, where would Christ have been here? This is one of those places these stories would have unfolded. Are you following me so far? Okay, let's turn the page. In the middle picture here, you will see one of the lintels at Capernaum for which they've not yet found a location. It was probably a doorway, or it might have been a lintel across some of the columns that they haven't yet been able to mate. But notice the carving on this end. First of all, you've got to look at it clearly because the picture doesn't help as much as some. I thought I had dropped another one in here which is bigger and closer, but this one will work. Notice this looks like a small building with columns and so forth, but notice under it, what do you see? Wheels. And if you look at it real closely on this end, you will see doors. That's harder to see because the perspective of the stonemason wasn't as good. But we come down here about 2/3 the way, and then we're really looking at, on a flat image, a front side of this cart. Can you see it at all?
Yes.
Okay. Let's call the ark, A-R-K, and the ark would have been stored in the tabernacle, which was a secure room where the scrolls were kept, and the scrolls would have been kept in the ark. So for the service on the holy day, they would have rolled this ark back out here alongside this white spot, and the president of the synagogue, just like the president of our congregation council, who is in charge of the order of that service, would have selected a scroll from it and handed it to the reader. 7 people on average were invited to read, and they read from the prophets and from the law. The prophets were 3 verses at a time. The law was 1 verse at a time. And then it was translated by the Targumist, T-A-R-G-U-M-I-S-T, from the root word Targum. The Targumist translated it because it was read in Hebrew. And in Jesus' day, few people understood Hebrew. They might be able to read it, but few could understand it, orally follow it. Like some people can read foreign languages but can't converse very comfortably. So there was a Targumist who translated it. And then the person who read it was invited to speak. Any questions about that? Okay. That's how Jesus gets on the program, because persons of repute were invited to speak. Key people in the synagogue, key contributors to the synagogue, key active people in the life of the synagogue. They were the ones that would have been called upon to read and then perhaps to comment. Then there was an open discussion about the comments. Their service follows very much, our service today follows very much in pattern the Hebrew synagogue service of the first century. We begin with a hymn. Usually I like to take to Pastor Dave, the opening hymn would always be a barn burner. There'd be one. Everybody can jump in on both feet and get the group together emotionally and spiritually. And then we have some opening prayers and some comments of welcome, gathering the people together. And then the second part is we read lessons. And the third part is we expound on those lessons. That's exactly the same pattern the liturgy follows to this day. Many, many scholars of great repute believe that the melodies that are ancient to Christians, the Lord be with you, are really rooted in early Hebrew melodies. Gregorian chants, its 7 tones, are all thought to believe are rooted in Hebrew synagogue melodies. I'm just satisfied to know that when my grandmother was in Switzerland, she sang it the same way. That puts the saints of one generation with the saints of another. And her parents probably the same. Even though they were Swiss Reformed, you're not very sure what they're going to do, but likely. Comments or questions about that? I'm dropping a lot of seeds that maybe you already know about. But this is how the system worked. This is how it would be that Jesus would go from town to town, known for his preaching, following crowd of adorers who would obviously be invited when he got to a synagogue. That would be like having somebody with some notoriety in our synagogue today. One of the funny things in Pennsylvania Mennonite life is that they have big churches, but they have floating memberships. You may belong to one church but never go there. You may visit around other churches. So on Saturday, the Lancaster New Era pretty well stays in business by this huge church page that has all these ads of special musical groups, singing combos, instrumentalists, all these kind of places. And they're all at different Mennonite churches. And the game is to entice the Mennonites from one congregation to yours, so they put it in your offering plate. That's the whole game. And Mennonites are pretty open about talking about it, that all this publication and all this big name thing is to entice the people away from Willow Run Mennonite Church to someone else Mennonite church. So that you don't really have fixed memberships. It's kind of a floating, worshiping community, and the guy that got the biggest show can hope to have the biggest attendance. The synagogues played that game too. So when Jesus comes through town, everybody's talking, this guy's preaching, he's something else. He preaches with authority. So the first time the synagogue president hears about Jesus nearby, he sets that up in a hurry. And so it happens in his hometown. Everybody's happy to have the hometown kid come to preach. I've even had once or twice in my home churches invited me. I don't take any offense that it's only once or twice. I'm too far away, you understand. But you don't dare preach anything controversial when you go. So, having said all those things, we pretty well got an idea what the synagogue was like and what it is to this day. To be frank with you, I was invited on the week of prayer for Christian unity. The synagogue, the conservative synagogue, which is the middle road crowd, actually observed that day of, but they didn't call it Christian unity, they called it a day of spiritual respect. And so I was invited to preach there, and I began the sermon for about the first paragraph in Hebrew. And I couldn't get any further than that because I'd virtually memorized it all, rote memorization. But it certainly impressed the rabbi, and when I got all through, Paul got up and said, you know, it's really embarrassing when this Christian comes and preaches to us in Hebrew, and most of the men in this congregation can't speak it. And he made a big thing of it. I thought, oh, don't ask me to do it again, you know. But I felt so comfortable with those people, and they with me, that I started going on Friday nights to their Friday night service, just as my own spiritual backing up and relaxing, and also learning from them. You know, they couldn't turn the lights on and off because that was changing creation on the Sabbath. So if I got there early enough, I could be the Sabbath goy. I could be the Sabbath Gentile that could turn the lights on and off. But once we were all there, we went back in the social hall, rolled all the tables out, put up the chairs, and I'm thinking, I said, wait a minute, Paul, I'm missing something here. And he says, oh, you know, you can't change light into darkness. That's a work of creation. You can't do that. But we are commanded to celebrate the Sabbath. So if we have to move tables to fulfill a command, that's not a sin. Oh, okay, I'll turn the light switch on and off. You guys move the tables. So it was all kinds of fun. Do you understand what I mean with fun? When neither of us is making fun of the other, we were simply learning from each other. And there's so much to learn. At any rate, and you tend to see, you see the Christian derivatives. For example, how many have done a Seder meal or gone to a Seder meal? Does it look, do you hear a lot of things that sort of sound familiar? Yeah, because it is this Seder meal that Jesus celebrated before the Passover when he kind of tweaked it a little bit and said, this is my body, this is my blood. We have the matzah, we have the wine. They got more wine than we get. But that's another story. Any other questions? Yes? Somebody had a hand up over here? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me get over here where I can hear it and repeat it for the microphone.
I just wanted to make a comment. I'm one of the people that went to the Holy Land this January, and the most profound understanding I got from the whole trip was my Jewish heritage.
Oh, absolutely.
I had not made that jump before.
Yeah.
And to realize
You've got to make that jump. And let me tell you why. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus taught out of a Jewish motif. Okay? For example, when he tells the story of the prodigal son, which is really the story of the waiting father, he tells a story like this. The guy goes out, he makes a fool of himself, and finally he comes to his senses and he says, I know what I shall do. I will go home and I will say to my father, I am no longer worthy to be your son. Just let me be a slave in your house. And the father goes out and won't hear it, shuts him off, doesn't respond to his offer, and celebrates and said, my son who was dead is now alive again. Why did I say you needed to be Jewish to understand that story? The word for repentance sounds like this, shuvu alai. And what it means translated literally is turn around and go home. So when Jesus is telling this story, his Jewish listeners already knew what he was going to do. Shuvu alai, he's going to turn around and go home. It gives you chills. But the root of the story is so Hebrew. And so, you know, the turnaround for me was not the trip to the Holy Land, although that certainly has helped. But how many ever took the ELCA or LCA course, Word and Witness? The ELCA course, Word and Witness. That was a dog, man. It was a 2-year course, and you had to agree to study at least 2 hours before each session. You had to sign a commitment to do that, which meant the teacher had to study about 4 hours before each session. And it was built heavily on understanding our Jewishness, and then out of that, extrapolating what the gospel says, which was the most awesome experience I ever had. And that's part of what sent me to the synagogue on Friday nights, just to absorb and find out what this is that helps me understand who I am. Curiously enough, in the synagogue, the rabbi never leads the service. The rabbi preaches, but the rabbi never leads the service. That's considered beneath his dignity. Lay people are responsible for leading the service. And the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah is germane to learning how to do that. To read the Hebrew and proclaim it and to do the liturgy. So that there should be a host of people, mostly men but now women too, who can lead a Friday night service. The rabbi sits and watches. And then he will make, what's the English word for rabbi? Teacher. And he will then, after the lesson has been read, the Torah has been carried out with great fanfare, from the ark or from the tabernacle up in the front of the synagogue, which they can do now with a little more secure housing. The whole thing has a sense of awesome symbolic nature about it. So I treasured the time. Paul is now gone. I treasured my time with him. And I think he with me. They were questioning, yeah. There was a story told one time, about how close Jews and Christians were. In fact, a Jewish fellow and a Christian merchant were talking about how they observed Christmas, and the Christian said, well, we go to our services on Christmas Eve, and the church is packed, and probably receive our biggest offering of the year. And the Jewish fellow smiled. He says, it's not much different. We're open all day Christmas Eve. We close early. And then we go home and count the money. And then we sing together, what a friend we have in Jesus. Just so we understand, this synagogue has deep roots and deep traditions. And then look how similar the synagogues were. Look on front page, that's Capernaum. Here is an actual 2nd century synagogue, a little further away where they had some limestone. And it's Baram's synagogue, and it's considered to be 2nd century. And then the third page, 1st century synagogue at Chorazim. And notice, what color is it? Black. And it's from the same it's about 2 miles from Capernaum. And so the black basalt that comes from, in fact, the volcanoes of the Golan Heights is used here. And this is considered to have been a 1st century synagogue. So on page 3 you have, and look, they're all about the same. Basilicas type, about the same scale. Bleacher seats on each side. 2 rows of columns holding up the roof. And maybe a balcony, and 3 front doors, which you can see here. And that same thing is true at Capernaum, but the picture I have for Capernaum doesn't show it. Well, we'll move on from the synagogue and say just a couple things about Nazareth, which I've already said. There's an argument going on among scholars right now as to whether Nazareth was a very, very small town, because it's not mentioned anywhere except in Scripture. Maybe as few as 400 residents is the modern thinking. First, because you would not likely had a 15,000 sized town in the area of Sepphoris, which is just about 2 miles away. But Sepphoris was a Roman city, and Nazareth was a Jewish town at that point, so maybe it was. Nobody's sure. What we're sure of is we don't find at this point a lot of archaeological evidence, but again, Nazareth is now a thriving city of some significant size, and what does that mean about archaeology? You can't dig it up, so you can't really know all that's there. So we don't know exactly how big it was. Now it's time to read the story. And I need somebody with a big booming voice that everybody can hear who can read that story for us. I'm looking all the way to the back of the room at Lee. Can you read for us? Loudly and clearly, please.
When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and a scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim the release to the captives and the recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed upon him. Then he began to say to them, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from him. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote me with this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things we have heard you did in Capernaum.' He said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. The truth is, there are many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine all over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to the widow of Zarephath and Sidon. There were many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Isaiah. None of them were cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all the synagogue was filled with rage. They got up and drove him out of town and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, that they might throw him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went to his way.
Thank you, Lee. That's the story. Mark and Matthew tell a similar story, but they don't tell the second half where he gets into some discussion with them. It just says they took offense at him, and he marveled at their disbelief, suggesting he could not do miracles because of their absence of faith. That's what Matthew and Mark do with this story. Up to there, the story is about the same. But Luke departs for a while, and so then, what do you think was the cause of the offense? Why did they get so angry?
He kind of said he wasn't going to help them.
I'm sorry?
He said, here was this prophecy fulfilled, and just like these other prophets.
Why don't you do here what you did elsewhere?
Yeah.
They've already heard. You remember I said he's been elsewhere first? They've heard what he did at Capernaum and other places. So they say, why don't you do the same things here that you did there? And he doesn't do that. Now, Mark and Matthew don't have that quote, but they have that accusation. And the implication is because of their lack of faith, Jesus was not able. In fact, they end their story by saying, Jesus marveled at their lack of faith. But Luke doesn't go there. Luke takes the story further. And for Luke, the issue of the anger is this. They were expecting, as all Jews did, that Jesus belonged to whom? Them, to the Jews, absolutely. And so he said, God's grace is wider than Nazareth. God's vision is broader than just us. For example, and then he uses 2 examples in the Old Testament, both of which they should have known. The healing of the Syrian military adjutant to the king, Naaman, of leprosy, told him to go wash in the Jordan, and he was furious. And he said, aren't the rivers of my country? And his servant said to him, well, if he'd asked you to do something hard, you would have done it. Why don't you do this? So he did, and he was cleansed. And so, but Then there's the story of the widow of Zarephath. It hasn't rained for 3.5 years. I think it's going to snow here for 3.5 years, but it hasn't rained there for 3.5 years. And so people were starving to death. There was nothing to eat. And so Elisha is sent by God to the widow of Zarephath. This is a Phoenician city. These are not Jews. These are Gentiles. But not to the people and Jesus actually draws the contrast. There were many lepers in Israel, but the Syrian leper was healed. There were many dying of the drought but in Israel, but he was sent to Syria. And they were furious because their understanding of God, and their furor is interesting because this is all solidly and prominently displayed in the Old Testament, with which they should have been fully familiar. But his reminding them of it was just too much. So that's probably the cause of the anger. If you go to Nazareth, sometime the guide will take you to the hill of the precipice, it's called, which is a sharp cliff, and you can imagine what would happen if you went down the side. Somebody shaking head, you've been there? Okay. All right. We've often thought of stoning as putting somebody in the middle of a circle and everybody picking up rocks and throwing. I guess it could be done that. But what was really done in stoning very often was to push somebody over a cliff, and if they still lived, push a big rock over on them. Questions? Comments? Why do we tell this as an epiphany story? You know what? I can just go on, and they'll just have to wait over there. Why do we tell this as an epiphany story? A story you ought to know and understand. Well, it's once again the story of Jesus bringing the kingdom of God into our midst. That's what this morning's sermon was about. The fact that we're called to live beyond the law. Not beyond the law by running stoplights, but beyond the law in living up to the mental spirit of the law rather than just the word of the law. Many people can live to the word of the law and be absolute crooks. It can be done. The word of the law never gets to the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law will meet you in the intersection in any crucial situation. There's no way to write a law that can cover every situation, but the spirit of the law will engage you. Am I making any sense at all? Other comments or questions? Today this is fulfilled in your midst. What he's saying in essence, I am here. For a Jew, that's been enough to stone him right there. That would have been blasphemy. But anyway. Well, thank you all. I hope this is useful, and it's a lot of fun for me, so thank you for your faithfulness. Thanks for being here.
Hi. Information next week.
I think so.
Okay, Miss,
You don't have a copy of the paper. Do you want one? Here it is. You have one. Okay.
You opened the door, the sermon this morning, and you didn't have time for my question, but I'm very much bothered by questioning how do we rationalize our current actions and policies